So let's jump into it.
Let's jump in.
So we did a webinar kind of like this already.
I know.
We've written stuff about it. Why are we still talking about
I know.
about ITP and Safari and why?
Right. Yeah. Good point. Good point. We did this already. So it's a really fast evolving situation. There's a lot of vendors that haven't quite figured out the proper solutions or workarounds. It's easy to hear solutions and it's hard to find if they are legitimate. And then Safari recently came out with another update in the shape of ITP 2.3, which further shakes up the whole situation and I think adds more confusion. So we thought it'd be good to review state of things, review some of the solutions that are legitimate and impact in general to your day-to-day as a digital analyst.
Yeah. So to start, I guess there's a lot of concepts and different buzzwords flying around ITP discussions, like link decoration or different types of cookies. Can you start by kind of clarifying what those terms are?
Sure. Yep, good point. So the first thing you likely are going to encounter when you start looking into the topic of browser protection and privacy is the concept of first-party versus third-party cookies. So let's just clarify that quickly. First-party cookies are essentially cookies that are set by the website that you're browsing on. So if you are on www.mywebsite.com and the website is using cookies for authentication, for remembering you as a customer, for trying to remember not to show you certain pop-ups and advertising, these should all be, in theory, as long as they are generated by the website you're on, first-party cookies. Technically, first-party cookies are set for the domain that you're visiting. So they should be set for the exact same domain that you have in your URL in your browser. Third-party cookies are set by not the website. And the general use case for this is to try and follow users across different websites. So the classic example would be you have an advertising network or a social network who's trying to follow you as you go through multiple websites. So if you are browsing www.sitespect.com and you have an advertiser who's trying to track you, it will try to set a cookie on advertiser.com, which is not the website you're on. So that's the third party versus first party cookie. Another one you hear a lot is, especially with ITP and all the workarounds that have been surfaced, is the concept of client-side versus server-side cookies. So client-side cookies are essentially set in the browser using JavaScript. Server-side cookies are set on the server, on the CDN, by a proxy. There's different techniques that can be set, but they're technically set using HTTP headers, so not in the browser using JavaScript. You might start hearing this concept of first-party cookies used in a third-party context, which gets really confusing. And it's essentially as these browsers have started to add more and more restrictions, advertisers have started to try and use first-party cookies as a workaround to third-party cookies. Another one that we hear a lot is link decoration. And I think it's a relatively new term for a fairly old technique. And link decoration is essentially this technique that a lot of us use if you're trying to, for example, you're trying to track users that are coming from your email campaign, and users will click on links in your email. You probably have some parameters that you include in the URL, source equals email and things of that nature, which enable you to do analysis and understand where your users are coming from. So link decoration is really just this concept of adding identifiers to the URL to identify where users are coming from. What you'll see and what you might find by reading on this topic is that advertisers have started to try and use referrer as a workaround to this technique. And I think those are probably the big topics that are worth clarifying.
Cool, thanks. So how do Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and the other browsers address privacy concerns now?
Yeah, it has changed a little bit from last time we went through this, but it's really mostly Safari that's sending shockwaves through the industry. So let's look at Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and Edge. I'll kind of leave the other ones behind because they're kind of in the less than 2% of global traffic. So starting with Chrome, Chrome dominates the market in terms of browser usage. So globally, we're talking 65%. In the US, it's more like 51% adoption. If you look at mobile traffic in the US, it's around 41%. So obviously a major browser that's critical in terms of how it impacts tracking and ad networks and web analytics and all these different technologies, A/B testing, obviously. Things haven't changed a whole lot for Chrome. It is starting to put in place options to allow users to decide on their own if they want to block certain things or not. But really, I think what's important is what's the default state of the browser, which is what most users do. They don't go and tinker with these things. And the default is that first-party cookies and third-party cookies are allowed in Chrome. There isn't a whole lot of restrictions there. Chrome has tried to push for a same-site cookie standard, which would allow developers to dictate if a cookie is meant to be used only for your website or shared with other properties. It doesn't seem like it's gotten a whole lot of traction. A big topic we see in this discussion is that browsers don't seem to really all come up with a standard approach so they can all kind of agree on one technique that we can all jump on. So Chrome is trying to push its own agenda a little bit here. Let's move to Safari. So Safari is globally about 16% in terms of adoption. In the US, it's about 33%, which is pretty high. And if you just look at US mobile traffic, it's about 50%. So that's a massive chunk of traffic for most websites here in the US. All right, so this is where it gets interesting and there's a lot going on. The general story with Safari is that they came up with ITP, which has disrupted the market. And Safari's main objective has been to try and prevent advertisers from tracking users across websites. That's always the theme. You know, all these updates all come down to trying to prevent trackers from following users across websites to protect users' privacy. So the story here is that Safari started to block third-party cookies. Then trackers found a loophole. Then Safari blocks the loophole. Then trackers find another loophole. And it keeps going and going. And we're at the 2.3 iteration. I expect to see more. It'd be disappointing if there were more in the storyline. So I'll just summarize the state of things. If you try to understand all the different restrictions in Safari, they tend to be broken down by ITP version, which I think is really hard to just compile in one easy, digestible summary. So at this point in Safari, under ITP 2.3, all third-party cookies are blocked. All client-side cookies expire after 7 days. Those are cookies that are set in the browser using JavaScript. And then if a user comes to your website from a known tracker, so that's Safari's own way to identify trackers and social media companies and all these different organizations are trying to track users. If you come from a website like that, the client-side cookies will expire after 24 hours. And then all non-cookie data will expire after, will be deleted after 7 days. So non-cookie data here is really mostly local storage, which is important, as we'll talk in terms of workarounds soon. But the big thing here is all third-party cookies are blocked. Client-side cookies are capped at 7 days. And then if user comes from a tracker, it expires in 24 hours, and local storage is wiped after 7 days. So that is Safari. And the general message here is whatever loophole people find, Safari will crack down on it. The objective is to prevent tracking across sites. All right, let's move on to Firefox. Global market share of about 4.3%, similar in the US. By default, Firefox blocks social media trackers. It's a slightly different strategy than Safari. So there's this disconnect list that you can look up. It has a whole list of all the recognized and known trackers. Firefox uses that to block them and prevent them from tracking and loading on websites. It blocks third-party cookies by default. In Firefox, it calls them cross-site tracking cookies, but it's really third-party cookies. It has other interesting tidbits. It blocks crypto miners, which are a type of malware that's using your browser's, your computer's resource to try and mine digital money. And it blocks embedded content, which is it blocks embedded content that has trackers. So if you have embedded in your website videos or maybe a payment solution or ads, and those contain trackers, it will block that. There's some discussion around how some organizations that are legitimate, that should not fall under these third-party trackers, are incorrectly flagged by Firefox. There was a story around Adobe being incorrectly labeled, and there's a process to reconcile that. So that's Firefox. Those are the big two at the moment that have an impact. Everything else is more or less in progress, and I think is trying to see where it's all going to go. Maybe the latest of interest is Edge Chromium, which is currently in beta, the next iteration of Microsoft browsers. It's very similar to Firefox in terms of approach, but it does allow by default third and first party cookies. I would be shocked if that didn't change slowly after it started to officially launch.
So what's the impact of all this on my kind of day-to-day operations and analytics? Is everything terrible now? Like, what do I do?
The world of data is coming to an end. Not true. The big piece here, the big takeaway is, unless you really pay attention to the details, you may not notice that things are not going the way you intend. And so at a high level, there's a segment of your user that is probably not getting the experience that you think they're getting. It could be because promotions and pop-ups and reminders that you think they should no longer see. A whole lot of Safari users keep seeing those repeatedly, and so that causes friction. So that's from a user perspective. From an A/B testing perspective, there's more here in terms of seeing consistent experiences, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then from a data, there's a whole lot going on. So let me just talk through a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about how it impacts your website's functionality, and then we can talk about how it impacts analytics and A/B testing. So from a website functionality, think everywhere you're leveraging the concept of remembering a user on your website for some functionality. There is probably something you want to look into. So all of your Safari users will be impacted by this. So if you're using client-side techniques, JavaScript, to remember not to show a reminder, a newsletter modal. We had a really great guest post on our blog that you should all read about this topic, and it mentioned how these GDPR announcements that we see everywhere, right? It's like click this to accept that we will set cookies to track you. Those are typically set using JavaScript cookies to remember not to show them. Safari users are likely seeing them a whole lot. So there's just a lot of friction here. And then, everywhere you're trying to recognize previously logged in users, you want to try and see if this is using client-side techniques to set the cookies. Safari users, once again, have disruption in their experience. So it's all causing friction, and all these great experiences we're trying to build are probably not working the way you think they are for your Safari users. From an analytics perspective, there's a couple of key metrics that are really being impacted here, mostly user counts by browsers and overall, new versus returning users, and then campaign attribution are probably the big three. So I'll just talk through a little bit. So essentially what's going on here is that from a web analytics perspective, cookies are really used to tie multiple page views into a visit or a session. And cookies are also used to tie multiple visits to a user. So this allows you to follow a user through a journey across page views and across visits. This is a key concept of web analytics. So if we start with the basics, the fact that cookies expire a lot more for Safari users every 7 days or every 24 hours means that a lot of users that were at your site previously will now show up as new users to your website. So if you were to go into your web analytics tool of choice, GA, Adobe Analytics, whatever it is, and you look at count of users per browsers, of new users per browsers, you would likely see an increase for Safari compared to these other browsers. That's one. If you were to just look at new versus returning users, and you're trying to see if you're doing good at acquiring new customers, and are you doing a good job at retaining repeat visitors, this is getting disrupted for Safari users. So all of those get diluted across your entire analytics data. It might make it look like there are certain trends that are emerging, but really if you segment and you look by browser, you should see that there's something going on. So new versus returning, if you look by browsers again, you should see that Safari doesn't show consistent numbers with these other browsers. If you were to compare, say, the last 3-4 months to the first 3-4 months earlier in the year, where there were less of these ITP restrictions, you should see a sharp switch in numbers. And everything should be like, it looks like you have more new users for Safari and less returning users for Safari. So that's massive. You know, if you look at your data and you're taking decisions based off of that, and 50% of your mobile traffic is Safari, you could make the wrong decisions here. You could think that, oh no, we're not retaining our users the way we did, and oh, we're getting way more new customers. That's great, which is not at all what's going on. So the last one is campaign attribution, which really takes all these concepts together. So if you're, if you're running marketing campaigns, attribution is important. It's this whole concept that users go through various steps in their journey before they convert or they make a purchase. So you likely have campaigns that are targeted at the top of the funnel, where you're trying to acquire users and move them through the journey, and you have campaigns that are maybe more geared towards pushing users at the bottom of the funnel, closer to the conversion. In the concept of attribution and analytics, you've got the first click, the last click. What is the first kind of channel or campaign that your users interacted with? Did that contribute to the final conversion? And then you've got these last click, which is what is the last touch that the users did before they converted. These are, really core components of really understanding the impact of your marketing spend. So all of this is being really disrupted for Safari users. And one example here would be, as a user, maybe your user first comes to your website through a Google search, and then comes a couple of days later through a Facebook ad and clicks on an ad. And maybe a third visit, a couple of days later, it comes to your website through an email campaign and clicks on a link in the email. In a Safari world, there's a pretty good chance that, that these are now treated as 3 separate users. The visits are not connected. You're going to end up seeing the first 2 visits not converting at all, and then the email, the last one, converting. So you might now make a judgment call that, okay, these initial campaigns, these first touches, they're not doing anything. They're not effective at driving conversions, but really it's a tracking problem. It is not a measure of effectiveness. So huge disruption in the analytics world. And again, if you don't segment, if you don't look at the details, if you haven't put any sort of workarounds in place, you might be reading the wrong insights from your data. All right, so that's analytics. Let's move to A/B testing. So first and foremost, if you're using SiteSpect, you're still good. SiteSpect is in the flow of traffic. It sets cookies in a server-side manner, so we're still not impacted by ITP. We don't really see how we would be in the near future until the world of cookies is completely overdone and changed massively. So SiteSpect customers are good. If you're using a server-side testing solution, maybe you're using an API-driven or SDKs on the server side for testing, you should be good. But again, it really comes down to how are the cookies set. So pay attention to that. If you're using any of the popular tag-based A/B testing solutions out there, you likely have an issue with your Safari user base for A/B testing. So think Adobe Target, VWO, A/B Tasty, Optimizely, just to name a few. If you're using the client side, the tag-based solution, there's probably some problems going on. So problems here are all the analytics problems we just talked about. When you're trying to analyze your test results, all these problems apply, from the concept of new return users, attribution. So data is being skewed. The other one is really from a user experience. You now have users that are getting randomly reassigned to different experiences. So again, a user comes to your website, gets assigned to a very specific variation within a campaign. You expect that user to stay within the same variation as long as the campaign runs, as long as the test runs. With Safari and with these cookies being expired, a user would come back to the website, be treated as a new user, and would now randomly get a new variation. which means from one visit to the next, you don't get the same experience, which is really disruptive. So it creates a bad user experience, and it makes the data really hard to use. You've got this kind of noise in your data set that's kind of polluting everything. So that's it at a high level from the A/B testing. And other areas would be, think of all the tools you have in your stack that are using a tag: product recommendations, personalization, voice of customer, surveys, all these things that set a client-side cookie to stop showing something or to personalize the experience. They have similar problems in everything we just talked about.
There are a number of workarounds that I've heard about. So you have people talking about local storage or server-side cookies. What are the best workarounds or solutions for this now?
Yeah, so this has changed very recently with the latest Safari ITP 2.3 update, if you're following. One important piece is that local storage is no longer a valid solution. A number of tools and vendors out there went to local storage as an alternative to client-side cookies, but that is no longer a good option with 2.3. Local storage is just not a good permanent way to store user behaviors or to recognize user cross visits. So that's one. If you've been leveraging that, it's no longer a good one. I'll talk a little bit about a non-solution solution, which is kind of a way to not look at the problem, but it is something that's actionable today with low effort. You can obviously segment out all of your Safari users from your analytics data or from your A/B testing data, right? Create a segment, exclude that from your results. It will remove a lot of noise. It will make a lot of your data more actionable and less skewed. So that's something really actionable. Doesn't solve the problem. It makes this big chunk of traffic kind of useless from a tracking perspective. Another one would be from your A/B testing perspective, exclude Safari users. Use an audience to target and exclude your Safari users from your campaign. So that's kind of not really a solution, but it's a way to mitigate the problem. The real solution here, which has been consistently valid and looks to be something that you can invest in the long term, knock on wood, is the idea of migrating from client-side cookies to server-side cookies. So all along, that's kind of been a suggestion that's been floated. Some vendors have really jumped on that and made it their own official solution now. And it's just a fairly technically solid solution to the whole problem. So there are a couple of ways you can achieve this idea of now I need to set cookies server-side. The good news is that it feels fairly robust as a solution moving forward. The bad news is that you still need to look at your different tools in your stack and kind of see how they will play with it. It's not just a plug and play approach. So server-side cookies, they can be set by your web server as HTTP headers. They can be set by the CDN also as HTTP headers. They're always essentially HTTP headers. There's a CNAME technique that we can talk about a little bit that's gaining popularity. And if you have a proxy that can also set cookies, which is really the way SiteSpect approaches it. So I'll talk a little bit about case by case. A couple of vendors have come out with solutions, and I think they're interesting just to illustrate how you can approach the problem. So I'll talk about Adobe, Google Analytics, and a couple other vendors. So Adobe is interesting because I think it describes one of the go-to solution that's been floated out there. It's the CNAME concept. So there's a whole description for how you can do it with Adobe. But the essential knowledge concept here is that you're creating a subdomain off of your own domain. So SiteSpect.com, we could create a tracker.sitespect.com. That's kind of a CNAME. And we're going to map it to an external service that will set the cookies server-side for our own website. This will make it so the cookies will be set for my own domain, SiteSpect.com, and they'll be set in a server-side manner. So if you follow through Adobe, you need to work with the Adobe Managed Certificate Program to request a CNAME form. You need to map the Adobe host names to your CNAME, and then you need to update all of your tracking libraries to leverage this new CNAME. So don't want to go into too much details here, but the general approach is you create a CNAME, which is a subdomain, you map it to a different location, and then you need to update your tracking libraries. The same approach has essentially been floated by the community for Google Analytics as a workaround. As far as I know, I haven't seen anything official from Google on it. There doesn't seem to be a real, hey, here's the Google point of view for how you should solve it. So there's a couple solutions floated out there, and one is essentially try to do the same Adobe CNAME approach, but spin up your own version of it. All these solutions involve either an IT person who update a CNAME or a developer to set up the tracker piece. So that's, the good and the bad. You will need to involve some development resources to solve this. Another piece that's interesting, just to mention some interesting solutions floated, VWO officially suggests doing a server-side cookie approach where you place this specific file on your web server and you update your VWO tag to leverage this piece. And so cookies will now be set server-side. I think it's an interesting approach. Optimizely suggests managing the cookie creation process server-side. They also have suggestions how you can use Akamai or your CDN to set the cookies. And then some other tools like AB Tasty officially say, hey, we've moved to using local storage, which is no longer valid. So I think it's a matter of time to see how these other vendors will come up with their own suggestions.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the review of the landscape when it comes to workarounds for solutions. So sadly, not just a one hit all, but the theme is server-side cookies is the way to go here.
Yeah. So it's been a lot of information we just covered to kind of wrap everything up and like put a bow on it. What are the three main takeaways you want people to take away from this?
So
today?
Number one, I think we could say if I had only one takeaway would be this number one, which is if you haven't started to look into it, it's a good time to start paying attention. The theme here is that there is disruption to your user experience and to your data. Key decisions are made possibly off of data that is not telling the real story, and your users are not having a great user experience. So start paying attention, I think, is good. We had, again, referencing this guest blog on our site. The quote was, on paper, everything would be working as you would expect, but not as you intend, which I think is very right. So start paying attention, start looking into it. Second, I would say it's a matter of priorities. I would put website functionality, I think, as a second as the second step here, which is try and see what functionality is leveraging client-side cookies. Try and see how much of that is critical to your user experience, to your business model, and if you feel like there's enough of a disruption to your user experience, move that logic server-side. If you have a really kind of high friction first user experience where there's a fairly lengthy login process or whatever that is, remember that Safari users likely go through that again and again and again. It's just degrades the user experience. Third, I'd say review tools in your ecosystem. Prioritize the ones that have the most value to your business and your organization. All of the tag-based solutions, you likely have an issue here. So yeah, I think those are the top three.
Thank you. So there's clearly still a lot to talk about with this. We do today have a couple minutes for a couple of questions. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and write them either in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And if we don't get to your questions during this session, we'll reach out to you after. But to start, can you, since we're talking about in a more general sense, can you talk about how these relate to GDPR or CCPA, and if they do? Yeah,
sure. So we touched on it a little bit. There's a disruption to the user experience just in terms of those GDPR pop-ups. So that's just something to keep in mind. If all these pop-ups you're throwing on your website to allow users to opt in or to let them know that you're collecting data, you think they're dismissed and they never show up again. They will show up again for your Safari users. So that's one thing to keep in mind. In terms of policy, though, there's no conflict. If anything, GDPR and CCPA, which is more or less the California version of GDPR, they're all about protecting users' privacy, allowing users to opt out of tracking, allowing users to get the data that you're collecting. There's no real conflict there.
Cool. Another question here is, so we're talking about kind of a reactionary shift and how to deal with data in the wake of these changes. How do you think we'll have to make, or do you think there will be more of a kind of systemic shift in how we collect and analyze data?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's a hard question. So this is my guess. It's as good as anyone. I think Google here is probably the main player that everybody's waiting to see what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Again, Google has the biggest share of the market in terms of browser usage. So the minute they change something here, it has the biggest disruption to ad collection, ad tracking, and all that. And if we remember, Google. Thank you, Google. If we remember, it's funny. Google's main source of revenue is from ads. So there's some conflict here going on. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be surprised if we would hear about an alternate way to track users that does not involve cookies. There's already been some Twitter conversations about Chrome engineers and other engineers from other, organizations that are floating the idea. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was a whole shakedown of the cookie concept.
Another question here is, so if I'm setting a returning user cookie, it's expiring quickly on Safari and muddying my data unless I take out Safari users. How can I more accurately report on Safari users?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. It is muddying your data for Safari users. The actions here would be, how are you currently tracking those Safari users? What tool are you using to look at this data? Is it in an analytics tool? Is it in an A/B testing tool? Find which tool is you are using to capture those behaviors, and then look at the workarounds we talked about. So if those tools are setting cookies client-side, which they likely are, then you need to find a way to migrate those cookies to server-side and have your web analytics tool play well with the server-side cookies. Sadly, again, there's nothing official for Google Analytics, but there are these solutions for setting your own cookie rewrite service and modifying the tracking script. It all sounds a little bit hacky. I'm laughing because I think it is a little hacky. But really, it's where you're reporting on those users, you need to find a way to get those cookies to be written server-side for your analytics tool.